He was publicly humiliated, rudely shoved out the door, all because of his red MAGA hat, as if it were a symbol of forbidden shame. The security guard reveled in his victory, completely unaware that he had just thrown out the owner of the establishment. The crowd was still laughing, but the man already knew he'd be coming back, and not to forgive. What happened next stunned even the most hardened witnesses. But let's start from the beginning. Standing at the entrance was Kevin, a stocky man in his 40s with a perpetually sullen expression that seemed to say, "I decide who's worthy." His gaze lazily drifted over each guest until it stopped on a man wearing a bright red MAGA hat. Jonathan Mason, a tall, fit man in his early 50s, was dressed in a tailored suit that radiated affluence. Yet, it was his hat that drew immediate attention, like a flare signaling the start of a confrontation. Jonathan approached the door with confident strides, seemingly unfazed by the judgmental stares of those around him. Kevin squinted, stepping forward. "Where do you think you're going?" Jonathan paused, his slight smile betraying amusement. "Inside, or is entry here reserved for the chosen few?" Kevin crossed his arms, staring him down with barely disguised disdain. "For everyone, except those wearing that." He nodded toward the hat. The crowd at the entrance began to stir, sensing the tension building. Someone discreetly pulled out their phone, while a young woman nearby smirked and whispered to her friend, "This is gonna be good." Jonathan chuckled softly, his voice calm and measured. "Forgive me, but I don't see a sign on the door banning hats. Or is this your personal policy?" "Listen," Kevin growled, stepping closer. "This isn't the place for political propaganda. Get lost before I call the cops." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, as though intrigued by the unfolding drama. "The cops? And what would the charge be? Wearing an inappropriate hat?" From the crowd, someone let out a stifled laugh, which only deepened Kevin's scowl. His face flushed as he jabbed a finger toward the door. "Get out before I throw you out!" Jonathan stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of mock surrender, but his eyes glimmered with a defiance that suggested he wasn't done yet. "All right, I'll leave. But are you sure you're ready to take responsibility for this decision?" "Absolutely," Kevin growled, his confidence soaring. The crowd exchanged glances, their curiosity now piqued. The young woman with the phone leaned closer to her friend and whispered, "There's no way this guy's here by accident." Kevin stood at the entrance, basking in his victory. His smug grin stretched wide, the look of a child savoring the feeling of wielding newfound authority. The crowd began to thin out, but a handful of onlookers lingered, sensing that the situation wasn't over yet. Suddenly, Jonathan reappeared from around the corner, walking with the same steady confidence, the unmistakable red MAGA hat still on his head. His face bore a faint smile, but his eyes told a different story. Cold and calculating, the gaze of someone entirely in control. "You again?" Kevin's scowl deepened as he stepped forward. "Imagine that, yes," Jonathan replied, his tone laced with irony. "It seems I forgot to thank you for such a warm welcome." Kevin let out an exasperated sigh. "You really want me to throw you out again?" "Oh, I'd love to see how you plan to do that." Jonathan crossed his arms, clearly enjoying himself. The crowd began to gather again. The girl with the phone resumed her filming, a gleeful smirk on her face. "This guy isn't leaving without putting on a show," she said to no one in particular. Kevin, aware of the eyes now watching him, grew even more aggressive. "I'm warning you for the last time, get out!" He lunged toward Jonathan, grabbing him by the shoulder. But instead of recoiling, Jonathan leaned in slightly, his voice calm and sharp. "Are you sure you want to put your hands on me?" Kevin faltered for a split second, but his frustration overruled his caution. He shoved Jonathan back. Jonathan, unfazed, took a single step back, adjusted his suit and turned to the crowd as if nothing had happened. "You all see this, right?" Jonathan said evenly. "This is what passes for customer service." The crowd buzzed with murmurs of agreement. Someone shouted, "Keep recording! This guy's out of control!" Kevin's face turned crimson, his temper boiling over. Reaching for his radio, he barked, "You've asked for this, buddy. I'm going to settle this right now." Settle it? Jonathan repeated, raising an amused eyebrow. That's quite a bold claim from someone who doesn't even know who I am. The crowd hushed. Kevin hesitated, the first flicker of doubt crossing his face. And who exactly are you supposed to be? Jonathan smiled faintly and spread his arms in a measured gesture, as if to give Kevin one last chance. Let's just say, I'm someone you really don't want to be on the wrong side of, and I'm giving you an opportunity to make this right before it's too late. Kevin snorted, trying to mask his growing unease. You bluffing? Bluffing? Jonathan glanced at the crowd, which was now openly discussing the guard's behavior. Well, why don't we find out? At that moment, the doors to the establishment swung open. A visibly flustered manager hurried outside, his face a mix of panic and irritation. He approached Kevin quickly, sparing a nervous glance at Jonathan, who stood unmoving, his composure unshaken. Mr. Mason! The manager exclaimed, his voice tinged with alarm and urgency. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Kevin froze, his expression morphing from anger to disbelief. Wait, Mr. Mason? Yes, Kevin, Jonathan said smoothly, his tone now edged with quiet authority. As in Jonathan Mason, the owner of this establishment. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. The girl with the phone zoomed in, her excitement palpable as she whispered, This is gold. Kevin's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The once confident security guard now looked pale and thoroughly out of his depth. The manager, a short man in a sharp suit, nervously glanced at Jonathan. His eyes lingered briefly on the red MAGA hat before moving to Jonathan's face. And suddenly, his expression turned ghostly pale, as if he'd just seen a phantom. Mr. Mason, he whispered, clutching his head in disbelief. Kevin squinted, confused by his boss's bizarre reaction. Who is this guy? He muttered, still trying to hold on to a shred of confidence. Who? The manager turned on him, his eyes blazing with fury. He's our owner, you idiot! What? Kevin staggered back, his cocky demeanor evaporating in an instant. You're kidding, right? Oh no, he's not joking, Jonathan said calmly, stepping forward. But it's funny how quickly you dropped your sheriff act. The crowd burst into laughter. The girl with the phone couldn't hold back her glee as she announced loudly. Now that's a plot twist! The guard kicks his boss out of his own club! Kevin began to stammer, his voice shaking as he tried to justify himself. I didn't know. You didn't say anything. And why should I have to explain myself to every overzealous gatekeeper? Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Or are you implying your behavior would have been acceptable if I wasn't the owner? The manager jumped in, eager to smooth things over. Mr. Mason, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding. I'll fix everything immediately. Jonathan turned to the manager, his voice now as cold as ice. Fix it? And how exactly do you plan to fix it? Will you give me back the time I've lost? Or perhaps explain to this crowd why your team operates on a policy of divide and humiliate? Kevin visibly paled, realizing how deeply the situation was turning against him. The onlookers were no longer trying to hide their disdain. One man in the crowd shouted, That's what prejudice looks like in action! Jonathan, addressing the crowd now, spoke with a sharp edge in his voice. It's not about the hat, is it? If it weren't for this, you'd have found another excuse. People like you always do. Kevin opened his mouth to respond, but all that came out was a pitiful stammer. It was a mistake. A mistake? Jonathan let out a humorless laugh. No, this isn't a mistake. This is your way of life, and I don't forgive mistakes like these. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of the girl with the phone whispering to her friend. He's about to get fired so hard, they'll hear it in the next city. Jonathan paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd like a seasoned performer, holding an audience in breathless anticipation of the final act. Then he turned to the manager, who looked like he was barely staying upright under the crushing weight of his nerves. You say you'll fix this? Jonathan's voice was calm, yet it carried a sharp, unyielding edge. Yes, of course, Mr. Mason. The manager nodded so furiously he resembled a malfunctioning fan. "We'll resolve everything immediately." Jonathan silenced him with an upraised hand. "Good, then we'll start right now. This man," he gestured toward Kevin, "no longer works here." Kevin, who had been standing with his head bowed, snapped his gaze upward, his face a mixture of shock and desperation. "What? Wait! This is all a misunderstanding!" "No," Jonathan replied, his tone cold and resolute. "You are the misunderstanding, and misunderstandings need to be dealt with." The crowd erupted in noise. Some clapped, others laughed, and the girl with the phone gleefully exclaimed, "That's it! This is definitely going viral!" Kevin's voice rose in a near-pleading tone. "Please, Mr. Mason, I didn't know who you were." Jonathan's gaze didn't waver as he replied, "Ignorance doesn't excuse your behavior. If this is how you treat me, the owner, how do you treat others?" The crowd hummed with approval, and someone shouted, "Great question!" The manager, his face now as red as a tomato, tried to interject. "Mr. Mason, it really was a mistake. Perhaps we could give him another chance." Jonathan turned his piercing eyes toward the manager. "And how exactly would that help the rest of your customers? This man didn't just discredit himself, he discredited your establishment." A beat of silence passed as Jonathan allowed his words to sink in. Then, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear, he declared, "Today, I forgive you, but tomorrow, I want to see that incidents like this never happen again. Make sure your staff understands the difference between doing their job and acting on personal prejudice." The crowd broke into applause. The girl with the phone chimed in, her voice triumphant. "Now that's how you handle business." Jonathan turned back to Kevin, whose head was now hanging low. The guard's posture showed that he knew there was no use arguing further. "And as for you," Jonathan leaned slightly closer, his voice quieter, but no less cutting, "I suggest you reconsider your outlook on life. Prejudice is not a profession." With that, Jonathan straightened, adjusted his suit, and strode away with the same composed confidence he had walked in with. Behind him, he left a crowd buzzing with admiration, and the defeated antagonist standing in stunned silence. The onlookers dispersed, their conversations alight with the dramatic scene they had just witnessed. Clips of the moment quickly began circulating online, gathering views and comments at lightning speed. As for Kevin, he remained rooted in place, realizing he had just lost not only his job, but his dignity as well.